Now, unless you've been living in a cave somewhere in the Grampians or Cape York, you may have noticed there is an election in the offering. That our beloved Prime Minister, Mr Morrison, has gone to the Governor-General, the writs have been issued, and our potential leaders are out there spruiking their bit. And Australia's jumping up and down and patting ourselves on the heart and on the shoulder and saying, what a great people we are. This is democracy in action. Democracy in action. Well, comparing a representative democracy to what we have to democracy is like comparing a T-model Ford to a Bugatti. Doesn't stack up. Demos, the people. Democracy, rule of the people, by the people, for the people. Of the people, by the people, for the people. That is the essence of a Fenian democracy, which is the first time in human history that we've seen a large group of people rule themselves and make decisions regarding their future. Not that a Fenian democracy was perfect. Women and slaves were not part of the decision-making process, but all male citizens were part of that process. Democracy, rule of the people, by the people, for the people. What is representative democracy? In Australia we have a representative democracy. It's not a consensus democracy, as we see here in this woodcut print of people gathered around a campsite in the Australian hinterland, discussing how they're going to govern themselves over the next few weeks as they camp here. This is consensus democracy. Representative democracy is a very simple concept. It's basically a two-cell amoeba compared to a fully formed human being. What we do every 3 years in this country on a federal level is we are forced by legislation to cast a ballot to elect representatives to make decisions for us for the next 3 years. And that democracy is based on the idea the person who represents us, who is eventually elected, who reflects the majority opinion in a particular community, will do that job and look after us, the people who have elected them. The problem with representative democracy is threefold. One, in the Australian system, under the Australian Constitution, there is no mechanism via which electors can recall non-performing politicians in between elections. I can promise you $1 billion, and if you're stupid enough to elect me, and you won't have that problem because I'm not standing this time, and I'm elected and I say, no, it was all a lie, there's nothing you can do about it. If you look at the political parties' policies, you will find the policies are basically a wish list via which they persuade you to cast a ballot in their favour. This is representative democracy. This is a weakness. And in some representative democracies around the world, including Switzerland and some states in the United States of America, electors have the power of recall. What that means is if 10% of electors are dissatisfied with the way a politician has been behaving, not keeping their promises, they can actually force a fresh election in that electorate for another representative or the same representative. So the power of recall gives the people the ability to have some power over their representative. The second problem with representative democracy is very simple. What we are asked to do in representative democracy is give somebody a signed blank cheque to make decisions for us for the next 3 years, irrespective of the consequences, irrespective of whether they've lied to us, irrespective of whether they had any intention of honouring any of their promises. The third problem with representative democracy is that it is dominated by a party system. Now, if you're part of a political party, which is the majority of members of the Senate and the House of Representatives in this country, either Labor, National, Liberal, Greens, Divided Nation, if you're a member of a political party, you are primarily responsible to the party that pre-selects you as a candidate in that electorate. You are not responsible to the electorate as a whole. It is the party that decides whether you're pre-selected in a winnable seat. It is the party which decides what the particular issues are that you will campaign on. So your first responsibility is to the party. It is never to the electorate. And the fourth problem of representative democracy is, because it's a winner-take-all system, what it means is that a significant proportion of the population are disenfranchised at the end of each election, because usually the two-party preferred vote is around 50, 51, 52 to 47, 48, 49. So for the next 3 years, 51% of the population are basically having their wishes imposed on a significant minority. And the fifth problem with representative democracy is that the person who's got the most financial backing is the group that will conduct the best campaign. And that's why it's very difficult for independents and minor party candidates to gain a spot in the House of Representatives or the Senate in this country. So the more money you can acquire for campaigning purposes, the better your chances of being elected. So what that means is that people with power, people who've got assets, can actually dominate the political process and, more importantly, dominate the type of policies which particular parties will espouse, because they're concerned, these particular parties are concerned that if they don't push policies that are, say, corporate friendly, that they will lose funding. So that's another issue. The sixth problem of representative democracy is the media, the legacy media as well as social media. What occurs is that the media has its own agenda. It will support political parties which basically, as we see in the Murdoch camp, which basically improve the financial outcome for the Murdoch media. So there's all these weaknesses in representative democracy. So I said before, representative democracy is a really bad way of people ruling themselves. So what's the alternative? Well, there are many alternatives, but an alternative which people talk about is direct democracy, and consensus decision making, which I don't particularly support, is a mechanism of direct democracy. In direct democracy, you delegate. In Athens, 2,500 years ago, male citizens were involved in a direct democratic process. They didn't elect representatives to make decisions for them. They made those decisions and then appointed or elected delegates to coordinate those decisions for them. So direct democracy, to a significant degree, is the type of democracy that exists in many of the more radical trade unions, where the membership makes a decision and then a delegate carries forth that decision to a central committee and then discusses at that committee that particular decision that's been made by all these different groups, and then comes up with a consensus version which goes back to the Assembly for ratification. The dilemma with direct democracy is that you need an engaged public. If people are not interested in the political process, if they're disillusioned, if they're cynical, if they don't believe change is possible, and there is no participation in the direct democratic process, well, then that process can be manipulated by small groups to suit them. But delegation is a much more effective way of making decisions. For example, during the Ballarat Rebellion, during the Eureka Rebellion in December 1854, the mass meeting was the vehicle by which decisions were made. We're talking about 20,000 people at a mass meeting, no PA system, no electronic bullshit. And these mass meetings would make decisions and then elect delegates to carry those decisions to the Governor Hotham in Melbourne. So the Eureka Rebellion was based on a direct democratic model. When the miners and their supporters took up arms, they conducted their military affairs by direct democratic means, electing the leaders of each division. So direct democracy gives a population a much more hands approach to the decision-making process and decreases the influence that people with power and money have on the electoral process. Because it's decisions that you're looking at. It's decisions about euthanasia, decisions about abortion, decisions about how much money goes, say to cooperatives and collectives, decisions about taxation, who pays taxation. So it's a very engaged form of democracy. Now many people say, I can't be bothered, and then complain when representatives don't do what they're told. So democracy is a moving feast. It's not a static concept, and our constitutional arrangements make it a static concept, because in the Australian Constitution, as we explained before, it's only Parliament, or a majority in Parliament, which can actually put a question to the people in a referendum to change the Constitution. Now, another way of actually introducing power to the people is through citizens-initiated referendums, which are held constantly in Switzerland. And Switzerland is no economic basket case. And what a citizen-initiated referendum is, that if 10% of the population sign a petition saying they want a particular question put to the people, that question has to be put to the people, and both sides of the argument have to be equally funded by the state, not by a private sector outside that. So decisions are made. Like there was a decision made I think about 18 months ago to actually abolish the Swiss military. 35% for, 65% against. But that decision was made by the Swiss people. So when you've got a citizen-initiated referendum concept, what you do is you bypass Parliament and put the decision directly into the hands of the people. When we had the marriage equality survey, it wasn't a referendum. It was specifically a survey for one reason. Because if the people, the Australian people, through a referendum, had decided that marriage equality was the issue of the day that should be supported, well then that would have been incorporated in the Australian Constitution, which would have meant Parliament would have not been able to change those regulations in Parliament through a majority vote at a future date. So, as we've seen with the privatisation orgy that has occurred in this country in the last 4 to 5 decades, now a lot of people thought that public assets were owned by the public because the public paid for those assets. And what we've seen is successive Labor and Liberal governments privatise public assets as the representatives of the people. As the representatives of the people, they make extraordinary decisions. As we saw just before the election was called, we saw the Liberal Party stack 145 people into powerful positions on government boards in this country in an attempt to hijack the political agenda for the next 2 to 3 years, because they know most likely they will lose power. As we see with privatisation, we see that assets which have been built up for the blood, sweat and tears of workers over generations are in an instant disappear. As we see with elected representatives who are elected for 3 years making decisions which bind us to, say, a trade pact for 40 years, although they've only got a mandate to make decisions for 3 years. So representative democracy is really a very, very, very amoebic form of democracy. It's not rule of the people, it's rule of the corporate sector. It's rule of those who have power. It's rule of those who have wealth, because they can actually dictate the parliamentary agenda. And it's no exaggeration to say that when you look at a picture of Parliament and you look at a picture of all the new representatives that will be elected after the 18th of May, what you can see is these puppet strings coming down, and that 1% of the community that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication dominating the legislative agenda. Because if people had their way, I'm sure we would have a substantial public health sector. If people had their way, I'm sure we would have a substantial public education sector, and the list goes on and on. But through representative democracy, what we are basically doing is shooting ourselves in the foot. So, Joe, what are you going to do? There's an election coming up in the 18th of May. Well, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You big boys and girls. There is a policy differences between the major parties on the peripheries. I mean, they all support the capitalist system. They all support inequality, although they claim they don't support inequality. You know, one party supports it more than another. You've got some minor parties which actually have different agendas which you can vote for. You can, if you decide not to vote and you're on the electoral roll, which is compulsory to be on the electoral roll if you're over 18 and a citizen, well then you can be fined for that. If you decide to vote informal, well, that's your business. Because all the legislation says is you go to the ballot. So I'm not telling you not to vote. I'm not telling you to vote informal. What I'm saying to you is there are different types of democracy. You've got ultimate democracy, which is consensus democracy, where people sit together, and you see a lot of this happening in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. It may take a day, it may take 2 days, it may take 3 days. It takes participation, decisions are made, and those decisions are carried out through delegates. Then you've got direct democracy, which doesn't rely on consensus but relies on a majority rule, but it's majority rule not regarding electing a representative to making decisions for you, but actually making the decisions and then appointing or electing delegates to coordinate those decisions at a local, regional, national, and in some cases even international level. I think if we had a direct democratic system, if we had the power of recall, if we had citizens-initiated referendum, we would have a very different country. And although it wouldn't be perfect democracy, it'd be a democracy of the people, by the people, for the people. So, as you prepare to make a decision about who you will cast your ballot for in the House of Representatives and the Senate, if you've got the right to vote in this country, think about that this is not the ultimate form of self-rule. Thank you for listening to me today. Hopefully we have encouraged you to think about the process, not just go there and have your name ticked off the roll and and think of it's all too hard. It's not all too hard. But the key is participation. Democracy is not casting a ballot every 3 years, sitting back and hoping that your representative will do what they promise. Democracy is about you participating in the democratic process on a daily basis by taking direct action, by being involved in protests, by signing petitions, by discussing issues with your neighbours, by putting pressure on your political representatives to represent the views of your community. This is where change comes from. It doesn't come from political parties. Political parties push change because it's been pushed from the grassroots. And the great initiatives that have occurred in our country since 1901 have occurred because of a push from the grassroots for political parties to take up that agenda, whether it's climate change, whether it's treaty, whether it's a fairer go, equality, fairness, and the list goes on and on. That push comes from below, and if we don't have that active participation by you on a daily basis, we will never have change that is significant in this country. Next week, we'll be talking about the 1st of May, May Day.